In the early years of Lee and Maxwell Enterprises, Alexander Lee and Russell Maxwell were an unbeatable team. Their shared vision and complementary skills turned a fledgling startup into an industry powerhouse. Alexander's methodical approach to strategy and Russell's charm brought in investors and opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. Their friendship deepened with every success, culminating in a joint celebration of their company's 5th anniversary, a night that marked the beginning of a deeper intertwining of their personal and professional lives. As their empire grew, cracks began to form in their partnership. Subtle disagreements over priorities and ethical boundaries crept into boardroom discussions. Alexander believed in discipline and long-term stability, while Russell often pursued riskier ventures for quicker returns. Despite their differences, Alexander never doubted his partner's loyalty, nor did he question the sincerity of his wife, Gloria, whose charm and elegance made her the perfect complement to his public image. However, the reality hidden behind polished facades would soon upend everything Alexander had built, both at work and at home. The dim glow of Alexander Lee's computer illuminated his tired face as he scrutinized financial data by the rain-streaked window of his home office. The rhythmic drumming of water on glass accompanied his late-night review, filling the otherwise silent mansion. Gloria claimed to be home, yet the vast estate felt hollow, as though her presence barely lingered. His cursor hesitated over a spreadsheet when a new notification caught his eye. Thomas Reed, his private investigator, had sent the weekly report. Alexander's jaw clenched, but he opened the message without hesitation. Photos loaded one by one, Gloria's silver Mercedes entering the Constellation Hotel's parking garage at 7:45 p.m. on Wednesday, her emerging from the elevator 40 minutes later in a red dress she'd said was at the dry cleaners. And the final shot, Russell Maxwell, his business partner, following her out a few minutes later, adjusting his tie. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Lee?" Maria, their housekeeper, stood at the door. "Mrs. Lee called. She won't be home until 11. Her dinner with Miss Orr is running late." Alexander checked his watch. 9:45 p.m., the same time Gloria always called on Wednesdays. "Thanks, Maria. You can go home." Once Maria left, Alexander opened his safe and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, adding tonight's new details to a growing list. Gloria's changing passwords, her gym membership across town, her new interest in book club meetings with no books. His phone buzzed with a text from Jonathan Griffith, his lawyer and oldest friend. "Got your message. Free for breakfast tomorrow?" Alexander replied. 7 a.m. at the diner on 7th. Bring everything on Russell's Singapore project. Closing his laptop, Alexander walked to the window, watching the rain blur the garden into shadows. 8 years of building Lee and Maxwell Enterprises from a startup to a multi-billion-dollar corporation, now undone by a hotel keycard and a red dress. The front door opened, followed by the click of heels on marble. Gloria's laugh echoed, her practiced theatrical laugh, perfected for charity galas. Alexander stayed still, listening. Her purse on the console, heels kicked off, the rustle of her coat. "Alex?" Her voice floated up the stairs. "Still working, darling?" He turned, composing his face into a mask of mild interest. "Just finishing up. How was dinner with Kate?" Gloria appeared in the doorway, her blonde hair damp from the rain. The red dress was gone. "You know Kate. 3 glasses of wine and suddenly she's spilling all her dating drama." She kissed his cheek. Her perfume mixed with the familiar cologne he'd noticed on Russell. "You work too hard, honey. Come to bed." "In a bit. I need to review these reports for tomorrow's meeting." She pouted playfully. "The company would collapse without you, wouldn't it?" Her phone buzzed and her expression flickered before she tucked it away. "Don't stay up too late." After Gloria left, Alexander returned to his desk and sent Thomas an email. "Keep up surveillance. Focus on the financials. I need every restaurant bill, hotel charge, gift, and everything on Russell's personal accounts." He leaned back, recalling the day he'd introduced Russell to Gloria at the company's 5th anniversary party. Russell had been charming, everything Alexander knew his wife would admire. Now he wondered if that night had been the start of it all, every laugh and touch a step toward betrayal. The rain picked up outside, masking the sound of Gloria's shower upstairs. Alexander opened the company's org chart and studied it. Russell might have Gloria, but Alexander had built something far more valuable, his network of loyal employees and board members, plus enough evidence of Russell's recent missteps to ruin him professionally. He scrolled through his phone to Marcy King's number. The CFO had been raising concerns about Russell's financials for months. Tomorrow's breakfast with Jonathan would be just the beginning, but Marcy would be key to what came next. A text from Russell flashed on his screen. "Drinks tomorrow. Need to talk about the Singapore expansion." Alexander's lips curled into a cold smile as he typed, "Can't." Breakfast with Jonathan, rain check. He powered down his computer, gathered his papers, and listened to Gloria moving around upstairs. Let her think her excuses were working. Alexander knew revenge, like success, required patience, precision, and seeing 10 moves ahead while your opponent was still playing checkers. Tomorrow, he'd start positioning his pieces. But tonight, he'd go upstairs and play the devoted husband, one last time. The best victories were the ones your enemies never saw coming. At 6:55 a.m., the corner cafe on 7th Street was nearly empty. Alexander took his usual booth in the back. Janet, the elderly waitress who'd served him for 15 years, brought his coffee without asking. "The usual, Mr. Lee?" "Thanks, Janet. Make it 2. Jonathan's joining me." She nodded, glancing at the stack of folders on the table. "Serious business today?" "Always is," he replied with a rare smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Jonathan Griffith arrived 5 minutes later, his suit a little rumpled from what Alexander assumed was another late night at the office. His briefcase was stuffed with documents as he slid into the booth. "You look rough," Alexander said, pushing a coffee cup toward him. "Spent all night on Russell's Singapore files," Jonathan replied, taking a long drink. "It's worse than we thought. The whole project is built on speculation and creative accounting." Janet returned with their egg white omelets and wheat toast, a nod to their wives' health kick. Once she was out of earshot, Alexander said, "Show me everything." Jonathan spread out a stack of reports between bites of toast. He's inflating projected returns, using outdated market analysis to justify the investment. But this is where it gets interesting. He slid a document toward Alexander. "Look at the subsidiary handling local contracts." Alexander scanned the paper, pausing. "Maxwell Pacific Holdings. When did he set this up?" 3 months ago. About the time your wife started those weekly dinners with Kador," Jonathan said, his tone careful. "It's registered in Singapore, but the ownership is hidden behind shell companies. He's funneling development fees through it, marking up costs by 30%. "The board doesn't know?" Alexander asked. "Not yet, but Randall Ramsey's been asking questions. You know how thorough he is with audits." Alexander nodded, recalling Randall's support when he first proposed the merger that formed Lee and Maxwell Enterprises. "What about Stephanie? Does Russell's wife suspect anything?" "She's too focused on her gala," Jonathan hesitated. "But there's something else. My new girlfriend, Kate..." "Kate Orr," Alexander interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Jonathan nodded. "Gloria's friend. Kate said something interesting last night. Gloria's been asking about divorce lawyers, specifically ones who handle high-net-worth cases." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Has she?" "Kate thinks Gloria's planning to leave you. She and Russell have been meeting at the Constellation Hotel every Wednesday for the last 3 months. Alexander's voice was calm. "I know." Jonathan stared at him. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Alexander said, pulling out his phone and showing Jonathan the PI's photos. "I needed to be sure. Now I am." "What's the plan?" Jonathan asked. "First, we get Marcy King's cooperation as CFO. Her concerns about the Singapore project will carry weight with the board," Alexander replied, sipping his coffee. "Then we start quietly working on other board members. Randall's questions were perfect timing. As for Gloria," his expression hardened. "Let her think she's winning. If she wants to leave, fine, but it'll be on my terms." Janet appeared with the coffee pot. "Refill, gentlemen?" "Please," Alexander said, waiting until she left again. "How quickly can you freeze Russell's access to corporate accounts?" "With enough proof. 24 hours, Jonathan answered. "But we'll need Marcy's sign-off." Alexander checked his watch. "She'll be in her office by now. Tell her I want to meet for lunch. That new spot near her office she's been wanting to try." He gathered the documents, his movements controlled. "One more thing. Start divorce proceedings quietly, but don't file anything yet." "Alex," Jonathan leaned forward, his voice cautious. "Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." Alexander placed several bills on the table, covering their breakfast and leaving a generous tip for Janet. "Russell brought this on himself. He could have had any woman, but he chose my wife. Now he'll lose everything, his company, his reputation, his marriage. And Gloria, she'll learn that betrayal has consequences." He stood, adjusting his tie. "Send me the Singapore documents. I have a board meeting at 10. It's time to ask some very public questions about our expansion strategy." Jonathan watched him leave. remembering the ambitious but cautious man he once knew in law school. Now Alexander moved like a carnivore. He dialed Marcy King's number. Whatever was coming, Russell and Gloria had already lost. Marcy's office on the 42nd floor offered a panoramic city view. When Alexander arrived at 1 p.m., she was already sorting through documents. "Lunch is here," she said without looking up. "Figured we'd need privacy for this." Alexander studied Marcy. Sharp features, glasses perched on her nose, the methodical way she worked. She'd been with the company 6 years, trusted for her financial oversight, and never fooled by Russell's charm. "How bad is it?" he asked. Marcy rubbed her eyes. "Remember the Q2 irregularities? It's worse. Russell's manipulating project costs, creating fake vendors, inflating fees. The Singapore expansion is just the beginning." A knock interrupted them as lunch arrived. After the delivery person left, Alexander unwrapped his sandwich. "Show me everything." For the next hour, Marcy detailed a web of financial misconduct. Shell companies, backdated contracts, suspicious wire transfers. With each revelation, Alexander's expression grew colder. "Look at this," Marcy said, pulling up another document. "Dinner for 2 at Le Cirque, charged as business development. A suite at the Constellation Hotel marked client meetings every Wednesday." Alexander's voice was low and controlled. "Yes, Alex." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Gloria. "Working late? Don't wait up." Alexander showed Marcy the message, then pulled up the PI's photos. Her eyes widened as she flipped through them. "That son of a witch," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Alexander replied. "You've given me exactly what I needed." He leaned forward. "The board meeting next month. I need you to present a full audit of the Singapore project. Every discrepancy, every questionable decision." "They'll crucify him," Marcy said. "That's the plan," Alexander said, his smile cold. "But first, I need you to meet someone." Right on cue, Jonathan entered, carrying his briefcase. "Miss King," he nodded, "I believe you have some documents for me." For the next 2 hours, they strategized. Marcy provided documents, Jonathan took notes, and Alexander watched as the city lights came on. "One last thing," Alexander said as they wrapped up. "This stays between us. Russell thinks he's untouchable. Let's keep it that way." Back in his office, Alexander saw a message from Stephanie Maxwell, Russell's wife. She asked if he'd be attending the annual charity gala next weekend. He confirmed and then called Jonathan. "How much does Stephanie know about the foundation's funding?" Alexander asked. "Nothing yet." "Why?" Jonathan replied. "Because Russell's been using company donations to fund it. Once the board sees Marcy's audit, the donations stop," Alexander said. "We need to make sure she has other funding options. Set up a meeting with her next week. Tell her it's about increasing our support for the foundation." After hanging up, Alexander stood at his window, watching the city below. Somewhere, Gloria and Russell were with each other, thinking they'd outsmarted him. His phone buzzed again, another text from Gloria. "Miss you? Drinks with the girls. Don't work too hard." Alexander didn't respond. Instead, he began drafting an email to Randall Ramsey, requesting an emergency board meeting. The pieces were in place, the allies secured. It was just a matter of timing. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk, him and Russell at the company launch, smiling, arms around each other. Tomorrow, he'd take it down. Tonight, it would remind him that in business, as in marriage, trust was a weapon that hurt the most when betrayed. The morning sun streamed through the boardroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. Board members filed in, their usual chatter subdued by the seriousness of today's agenda, Russell Maxwell's proposed expansion plan. At the head of the table, Russell exuded confidence as he handed out presentation folders. "What I'm about to show you will transform our position in the Asian market," he said, clicking through his PowerPoint slides. Alexander observed from his seat, noting Russell's trembling hands despite his smooth delivery. Marcy King, sitting beside him, quietly arranged her financial reports, ones that painted a much different picture than Russell's glowing projections. "The Singapore project is a huge opportunity," Russell continued, "a $500 million investment with a 30% return within 18 months. Randall Ramsey, head of the audit committee, adjusted his glasses. "Ambitious numbers. What's the basis for these projections?" "Market analysis and agreements with local partners," Russell replied, his smile unwavering, though a bead of sweat formed at his temple. "All the documentation is in your packets." Randall raised an eyebrow, pulling out another set of papers. I have the latest market reports from Singapore, and they show a 15% decline in the sector you're targeting. The room went cold. Russell's smile faltered. Those reports must be outdated. Our research shows— I think we should hear from our CFO, Alexander interjected. All eyes turned to him. Marcy, what's your take? Marcy stood and connected her laptop to the projector. The screen filled with charts and numbers that made several board members lean in. We've thoroughly analyzed the expansion. The returns Russell presented assume a best-case scenario and don't align with current market trends. We've also spotted concerning patterns in the preliminary expenditures. Russell's face reddened. Those are just draft numbers. I can explain. Please do, Alexander said smoothly. Like the $2.3 million in consulting fees paid to Maxwell Pacific Holdings, a company registered in Singapore 3 months ago? The room erupted in murmurs. Russell gripped the table, his knuckles white. That's standard for international deals. We needed a local entity. A local entity that lists you as the sole beneficiary, Randall cut in. That's a conflict of interest, Russell. Alexander! Russell turned to his partner, desperation creeping into his voice. You know how these deals work. Sometimes we need flexible arrangements. Alexander met his gaze coldly. Does that flexibility usually involve charging personal expenses to the company, like weekly bookings at the Constellation Hotel? The room fell silent. Russell's face went pale as the expense report appeared on the screen, with the hotel charges highlighted in red. I move to suspend the expansion plan until we complete a full audit, Randall said, his voice firm, and freeze all discretionary spending until we understand the scope of these issues. I second the motion, another board member added. Russell looked around, seeing no allies among the board. This is ridiculous, Alexander. We built this company together. You can't— All in favor? Alexander's calm voice cut through the tension. Hands rose around the table. Russell's confidence crumbled as his empire began to unravel. Motion carried, Alexander announced. Marcy, secure all relevant accounts by the end of today. Russell, you'll be available for the audit team's questions. As the board members filed out, Russell stayed rooted to the spot, staring at the damning numbers on the screen. Alexander gathered his papers slowly, feeling Russell's eyes on him. How long have you known? Russell whispered. Alexander paused at the door. Long enough to know betrayal comes in many forms. Some professional, some personal. He turned to face Russell. Some I'll deal with later. Russell's face drained of color as understanding dawned. Before he could respond, Alexander's phone buzzed. It was a text from Gloria. Lunch today. Miss you. You should answer that, Alexander said, noting Russell's instinctive move toward his own phone. It might be important. He left the boardroom, leaving Russell to face the wreckage of his plans. In the elevator, Alexander quickly messaged Jonathan. Phase 1 complete. Proceed with Phase 2. At home, Alexander reviewed audit reports in his office, his sanctuary in the battle against Russell's betrayal. The evening sun cast long shadows across his desk when Gloria appeared in the doorway, dressed in a designer outfit. You've been impossible to reach today, she said, irritation in her voice. Board meeting ran long. Russell's expansion plan didn't go as planned, Alexander replied, not looking up. Gloria's fingers tightened around her phone. That's surprising. He seemed so confident. Confidence doesn't always mean competence, Alexander said, finally looking up. He noticed her lipstick was freshly reapplied. How was your day? Fine. Lunch with Kate. Shopping, she answered, her tone slightly off. You've been working so much lately, I barely see you anymore. The Singapore project needs attention, Alexander replied, watching her closely. Russell's decisions have put us in a tough spot. Gloria's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, her expression flickering with concern. I should let you work. Will you be up soon? Don't wait up, Alexander replied. After Gloria left, Alexander opened his laptop and sifted through surveillance photos of her and Russell at La Bernardin that afternoon. They sat close, his hand covering hers, speaking in urgent whispers. The photos came with a note from his PI. Maxwell looked agitated. Meeting lasted 47 minutes. His phone rang. Jonathan Griffith. The charity gala's this weekend. Stephanie Hopkins confirmed your attendance. Perfect, Alexander replied. And Gloria? Kate convinced her to go shopping for a new dress tomorrow. She'll make sure it's something memorable. The weekend arrived with perfect weather for the Hopkins Foundation's annual gala. Held at the Metropolitan Museum's rooftop garden, it was a glittering affair. Alexander arrived fashionably late and noticed how Russell and Gloria carefully maintained their distance. stealing nervous glances when they thought no one was watching. Stephanie Hopkins, radiant in midnight blue, greeted him warmly. "I'm so glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it." He kissed her cheek, aware of Russell watching from across the garden. "Your foundation's work is impressive. I've been reviewing the reports." "Thank you," she smiled, "though I'm a bit worried about next year's funding. Russell's been evasive about the company's usual contribution." "Has he?" Alexander guided her to a quiet corner. "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you. I'm particularly interested in your educational initiatives." They stood close enough to where Gloria was with Kate, pretending not to watch Russell struggle to network with board members who suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. "Your work is important," Alexander said louder now. "It'd be a shame if anything threatened its funding." Stephanie's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "Maybe we should review the foundation's financial structure. Over lunch next week, I might have suggestions for its long-term stability." Later, as the party wound down, Alexander watched Gloria and Russell share a brief, tense conversation by the elevators. Their distance, her fidgeting with her clutch, and Russell's subtle shake of his head all signaled panic. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcy. "Audit team found something big. Emergency board meeting for Monday." Alexander sipped his champagne, watching his wife and business partner realize their world was falling apart. Timing was everything. Monday brought steady rain, turning Manhattan into a maze of umbrellas and traffic. Alexander sat in his office, reports from the audit team flooding his inbox. A knock on his door revealed Jonathan, his face grim. "Russell's been trying to access restricted accounts. 3 attempts to wire funds to Singapore." "Desperate men make desperate choices," Alexander said, turning from the window. "What's his financial situation?" "Bad. He's leveraged everything on this expansion. With the board freezing the project, he's starting to crack." As if on cue, Russell barged in, panic replacing his usual polish. "This has gone far enough, Alexander. Call off the audit." "Sit down, Russell." Alexander's tone was firm. "Jonathan, give us a minute." Once alone, Russell paced. "You're destroying everything we built. Over what? A disagreement? Is that what we're calling it?" Alexander's voice was calm. "This afternoon, the board will receive a report on your financial misconduct. Unauthorized accounts, embezzled funds, fake consultancy fees, personal expenses charged to the company, including hotel rooms." Russell froze. "Alex, don't—" "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Alexander said, cutting him off. "I knew about you and Gloria. You've been sloppy. Now you'll lose everything. Your position, reputation, marriage. You can't prove anything." "I already have." Alexander slid a folder across the desk. "The board meets at 2. You might want to consider resigning before they see this." Russell snatched the folder, shaking as he flipped through the evidence. Without a word, he stormed out. The morning passed in a blur of meetings. By lunch, the office buzzed with rumors of something big. Alexander worked through his sandwich, reviewing his presentation for the board. His phone lit up with a text from Gloria. "We need to talk. Coming to your office." Minutes later, she stood in his doorway, her usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "What have you done to Russell?" "I haven't done anything," Alexander replied coolly. His own actions caught up with him. "He's falling apart," Gloria said, voice shaking. "He called me this morning talking about leaving the country." "Are you worried about your lover or your lifestyle?" Alexander's question cut through her protests. "Don't worry. You'll both get exactly what you deserve." She stared at him, realization sinking in. "You knew. All this time you knew about us. Did you think you were clever? The Wednesday night dinners, the secret business meetings?" He walked to the window. "You should go home, Gloria. Pack what matters to you. The next few days will be unpleasant. You can't do this." "I already have." He turned back to her. "It's done. All of it." Before she could respond, his intercom buzzed. "Mr. Lee, the board is assembling." "Thank you, Sarah." He gathered his papers. "You should go, Gloria. Your boyfriend has an important meeting to attend." Alexander entered the boardroom at exactly 2 p.m., followed by Marcy King and Jonathan. Russell sat alone at the far end of the table, his usual allies missing. For the next hour, Marcy presented their findings: bank statements, wire transfers, and falsified reports. The evidence piled up, stripping Russell of any remaining dignity. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. Russell Maxwell was removed from his position, and his access to company resources was terminated. As security arrived to escort him out, Russell turned to Alexander one last time. "You've won. Are you happy now?" Alexander straightened his tie, unaffected by the wreckage around him. Happiness was never the goal, Russell. Justice was. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his home office, waiting. He heard Gloria's heels on the stairs, her nervous energy palpable even through the closed door. His phone buzzed with a message from Jonathan. "It's done. All accounts frozen. Divorce papers ready." Alexander closed his laptop, listening to Gloria's footsteps draw closer. The trap had closed perfectly, but there was still one final scene to play out. Rain hit the windows as Gloria paced in front of Alexander's desk, her designer heels clicking on the hardwood floor. Her earlier confidence was cracking under his steady gaze. "Why aren't you angry?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I just told you I've been sleeping with your business partner for months." Alexander leaned back in his chair, calm. "Tell me, Gloria, after all those months with Russell, did you ever wonder why it was so easy? Why I never questioned your Wednesday night dinners or your sudden interest in Kate's love life?" Her face drained of color. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, opening his laptop, "that Russell's about to learn a hard lesson about mixing pleasure with business." He turned the screen toward her, showing documents that made her stumble back into the chair. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The board's emergency meeting concluded an hour ago," Alexander said with a cold smile. "Russell's financial misconduct has forced an emergency restructuring. Your lover doesn't know it yet, but his company now belongs to me." Gloria gripped the armrests. "You're lying. Russell would have told me if he was losing everything? If his Singapore project was built on embezzled funds?" Alexander walked to the drink cart. "Russell's too busy watching his empire crumble to warn his mistress. Want to see the termination papers? They're quite thorough." "Termination?" She jumped to her feet. "You can't fire him. He built this company with you." "And then he betrayed everything we built," Alexander said, pouring himself a scotch. "The board voted unanimously. Russell will be removed as CEO tomorrow. Meanwhile, Stephanie has already filed for divorce with evidence of his financial misconduct." Gloria collapsed into the chair, her arrogance crumbling. "Stephanie knows about the affair?" "Not yet," Alexander replied, sipping his drink. "But she knows about Russell using company funds to finance your rendezvous, the shell companies, the misappropriated assets. She's grateful for my help protecting her foundation's interests." "The foundation?" Gloria's eyes widened. "The gala. When you told Stephanie it would be a shame if anything threatened the funding." "I was making sure she understood her options," Alexander said. His phone buzzed with a confirmation from Jonathan. "Just as I'm ensuring you understand yours." Gloria's panic turned to desperation. "Alex, please, we can fix this. I made a terrible mistake, but—" "Save it," he cut her off. "I've watched you play the devoted wife for months. It's not convincing anymore." "You cold-hearted fool," she spat. "You set us up. All those business meetings, the late nights, you were orchestrating this." "No, Gloria," Alexander said quietly but firmly. "You and Russell orchestrated your own downfall. I just made sure you had enough rope to hang yourselves." He moved to the window. "Russell chose to embezzle company funds to impress his mistress. You chose to betray our marriage for cheap thrills with him. I simply chose the consequence." Her phone buzzed, Russell's name flashing on the screen. Alexander smiled as she stared at it, panic rising. "You should answer that. I imagine he has quite a bit to say about tomorrow's board announcement." Gloria grabbed her phone, reading Russell's frantic messages. "This will destroy him," she whispered. "That was the point," Alexander replied, his voice devoid of remorse. "Did you really think you could flaunt your affair, spend my money, and face no consequences? I'll fight you," she threatened weakly. "Both of us will." "Both of us?" He laughed coldly. "Gloria, Russell's facing criminal charges for financial fraud. His assets are frozen, his reputation is ruined, and his wife's lawyers are circling. He won't be fighting anyone except prosecutors." The rain intensified, matching the storm on Gloria's face. Another message from Russell flashed on her phone. "He's being escorted out of the building as we speak," Alexander said. "Security is quite efficient when properly motivated." Gloria stood unsteadily, fear replacing her earlier confidence. "What happens now?" "Now," Alexander said, sliding a thick envelope across the desk. "You leave. The divorce papers are ready. Your things will be moved to storage. Your access to our accounts has already been terminated." You can't just— I can, and I have, he replied. The prenuptial agreement you signed is very clear about infidelity. You'll find the terms ungenerous. Gloria stared at the envelope, tears breaking through her composure. But Alexander saw no remorse, only the realization that her world was collapsing. Why like this? She asked, voice barely audible. You could have confronted us months ago. Alexander's expression remained unchanged. Because revenge, like business, requires patience and precision. You thought Russell was the powerful partner. I wanted you both to understand how wrong you were. Her phone buzzed one last time. Another message from Russell, which drained the color from her face. Ah, Alexander noted. He's heard from Stephanie's lawyers. Timing is everything, isn't it? The rain continued its steady rhythm as Gloria realized the full impact of her choices. In one evening, she lost her marriage, lifestyle, and the man she'd risked everything for. Alexander, the husband she'd underestimated, watched her world burn with cold detachment. The next morning was bright and unforgiving. Russell Maxwell arrived at Lee and Maxwell Enterprises for the last time, surrounded by security guards and a dozen smartphone cameras. I'm sorry, Mr. Maxwell, said James, head of security, blocking his path. Your access has been revoked. This is my company, Russell yelled, his anger palpable. Not anymore, Jonathan Griffith said, stepping forward with two attorneys. The board's decision is final. Don't make this worse than it already is. Inside, employees watched from the windows as Russell's meltdown continued. His suit couldn't hide the sweat pouring down his neck as he pointed at Jonathan. Where's Alexander? Too scared to face me? Mr. Lee's in a board meeting, Jonathan replied, his tone cold. He's discussing the company's future with our new partners, like Mrs. Maxwell. The mention of his wife struck Russell like a punch. Stephanie, what do you mean? Jonathan handed him a thick envelope. These are from her lawyers. Along with the divorce papers, you'll find a record of your financial misconduct. Russell ripped open the envelope, his face turning from red to pale as he read the documents. This is impossible. These accounts were private. Nothing's private when you misuse company funds, Jonathan said, glancing at his watch. A car is waiting to take you home. I suggest you pack up your office. Under supervision, of course. Meanwhile, Marcy King watched from her office, texting Alexander. Status, he's here. Starting to realize what he's lost. Good. Keep me updated. In the lobby, Gloria arrived in last night's clothes, mascara smeared, demanding to see Alexander. I'm sorry, Mrs. Lee, the receptionist said flatly. You've been removed from the authorized visitor list. Removed? Gloria's voice rose. I'm his wife. Not for long, a familiar voice cut in. Kate Orr stood by the security desk, now wearing a legal department badge. Gloria, don't make this worse. What are you doing here? Gloria snapped. Watching Karma, Kate replied, a cold smile on her face. All those Wednesday night dinners you needed covered? I passed every detail to Jonathan. My boyfriend found them interesting. Gloria's face drained of color. You were spying on me? She whispered, horrified. Guess Alexander noticed more than you thought, Kate said, her tone sharp. As Gloria's protests grew louder, security moved in. Russell, packing his things in the conference room, could only watch as his world collapsed. Upstairs, Alexander sat with Stephanie Hopkins Maxwell, finalizing the foundation's new funding structure. The board approved a 5-year commitment, he explained. Your educational initiatives will be fully funded, no matter what happens with the company. Stephanie signed the documents with steady hands. I should have seen this coming. He fooled a lot of people, Alexander replied, his tone neutral. The real question is, what's next? Protect what I've built, she said firmly. Russell can lose everything, but he won't take my foundation down. As their meeting continued, commotion from the lobby caught their attention. Through the glass walls, they saw Gloria being escorted out, her dignity shattered as she shouted at anyone nearby. Hell hath no fury, Stephanie remarked. Like a gold digger scorned, Alexander added, returning to their papers. Now, about the new board structure. The day unfolded as a perfect storm of destruction. Russell's personal items were boxed up and shipped. His executive parking spot was reassigned. His name was removed from the company letterhead. By evening, news outlets buzzed with updates on the corporate shakeup. Social media was rife with speculation about the future of the Singapore project, while society columnists whispered about the twin divorces shaking Manhattan's elite. In his office, Alexander watched the sun set over the city. His phone buzzed nonstop. messages from board members, employees, and reporters. But one message stood out from Gloria. "I hope you're happy. You've destroyed everything." He typed back, "No, Gloria. You did that yourself." 2 months passed, and Lee International emerged from the storm of change. The Maxwell name was gone, replaced by a sleek new logo that symbolized Alexander's successful takeover. Employees, not fearful but in awe, respected the precision with which he'd transformed the company. In his expanded corner office, Alexander reviewed the latest quarterly reports. The numbers reflected recovery and growth, investor confidence restored, stock prices stable, and the Singapore project thriving under new management. A knock on the door interrupted his focus. Marcy King entered with a bottle of champagne. "Thought you might want to celebrate," she said, setting the bottle down. "The SEC just closed their investigation into Russell's activities." "Criminal charges?" Alexander asked, accepting the glass she offered. "Multiple counts of financial fraud. His lawyers are scrambling for a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming." Alexander smiled faintly. "Jonathan doesn't miss a detail." Marcy continued. "Gloria's divorce was finalized this morning. Kate said she's staying with her sister in Connecticut." "Running away is all she's good at," Alexander replied, glancing out the window at the city below, his empire reflected in the glass. Marcy pulled up a news article on her tablet. "Have you seen today's Society pages?" she asked, handing it to him. The headline read, "Double Divorce Drama. Manhattan Power Couples Fall from Grace." The photo showed Russell leaving court looking years older, clutching legal papers. "Stephanie's foundation is thriving," Marcy added. "The new board position suits her." "She earned it," Alexander said, his tone genuine. "She understands what it means to build something real." His phone buzzed with an email from Jonathan. Russell's remaining assets have been seized. The once powerful man now faced jail time and a ruined reputation. "You planned this perfectly," Marcy remarked. Alexander shook his head. "It wasn't a plan. I just made sure I was prepared. That's all we can do." A comfortable silence followed as they watched the city lights flicker on. Workers filtered out of the building, their lives unaffected by the corporate drama. "Do you regret any of it?" Marcy asked, breaking the quiet. Alexander considered the question. "They made their choices. I just made sure there were consequences." His computer chimed with new projections showing Lee International's strongest performance yet. Success, it seemed, was the sweetest revenge. 2 years later, Lee International's transformation was complete. The Singapore project, once a symbol of mismanagement, was now the company's most profitable division. Investor confidence soared, and Forbes published an article, "From Betrayal to Billionaire: The Rise of Alexander Lee." Meanwhile, Gloria faded from the spotlight. Struggling to rebuild in Connecticut, her once glamorous life had become a cautionary tale. Her social media profiles vanished after relentless trolling, her fall from grace now a whispered story. She was last seen working as a real estate agent, far removed from her past. Russell fared no better. The SEC's investigation had revealed financial fraud, leading to his indictment. After a brief trial, he accepted a plea deal: 5 years in a minimum security prison, complete asset forfeiture, and a lifetime ban from any publicly traded company. In prison, Russell reportedly spent his days following Lee International's stock ticker, a daily reminder of his downfall. 5 years later, Lee International's headquarters towered above Manhattan's skyline, a symbol of Alexander's dominance. The company's rise was now a case study in corporate resilience. Inside his office, Alexander reviewed acquisition reports. Lee International's market value had tripled since Russell's fall, each success proving Alexander's belief that betrayals, when handled correctly, could become opportunities. A knock at the door revealed Jonathan Griffith, now chief legal officer, and his wife, Kate. Their marriage, celebrated 2 years ago, had marked the union of two key players in Russell and Gloria's downfall. "Thought you'd want to see this," Jonathan said, placing a newspaper on Alexander's desk. The headline read, "Former executive Russell Maxwell denied early release." 3 years down, 2 to go, Kate remarked, settling into a chair. The judge wasn't impressed by his appeal. Alexander scanned the article, noting that Russell's fall was complete. After his release, the terms of his plea deal would prevent him from rebuilding his life. "Any word on Gloria?" Alexander asked. Kate smiled. "Still hiding in Connecticut. Her sister kicked her out last year. She's working as a real estate agent now, trying to rebuild her life." Jonathan added, "Her social media is enlightening. The woman who once attended the elite charity galas now advertises suburban homes, her designer wardrobe replaced with practical suits." Alexander glanced briefly at the photo on Jonathan's screen before returning to the documents on his desk. She tried dating an executive last year, Jonathan noted, until he Googled her. Your story's quite the cautionary tale in certain circles, Kate added with a smirk. Alexander's phone buzzed with an email from Marcy King, now his trusted CFO. The latest quarterly numbers exceeded projections again, a testament to her skill in untangling Russell's financial mess. Stephanie's foundation just partnered with the Gates Foundation, Alexander said, showing a press release, maintaining that funding was one of our smartest decisions. Stephanie Hopkins had shed the Maxwell name after her divorce and turned her humiliation into triumph. Her foundation now operated in 12 countries and thrived alongside her marriage to a respected federal judge. Did you see Russell's latest appeal? Jonathan asked, handing Alexander a document. He's claiming mental distress, blaming shame and isolation for his struggles. Prison tends to do that, Alexander replied without sympathy. The report detailed Russell's current state, assets seized, reputation destroyed, and a lifetime ban from corporate leadership. Even his former allies avoided him. Gloria tried visiting him last year, Kate said. He refused, blaming her for everything, claiming her demands during the affair forced him to embezzle. Alexander chuckled. They deserved each other. His intercom buzzed, reminding him of the board meeting. 5 years after the scandal, Lee International's board was unrecognizable, rebuilt with loyal and competent members who shared Alexander's vision. One more thing, Jonathan said. Gloria's lawyer contacted us. She's writing a memoir and wants the NDA lifted. Absolutely not, Alexander replied firmly. She made her choices, and she doesn't get to profit from them. After Jonathan and Kate left, Alexander stood by his office window surveying his empire. 5 years ago, he'd watched Gloria and Russell's worlds collapse. Now, his company thrived, a testament to his calculated decisions. A news alert flashed on his phone. Russell Maxwell's latest business venture files for bankruptcy. Even from prison, his attempts to rebuild had failed, thanks in part to Alexander's quiet influence, which ensured no one would work with him. Another message arrived from a private investigator. Gloria's real estate career barely covered her rent in a modest Connecticut apartment. The once glamorous socialite now struggled to rebuild her life, aging quickly without the luxury treatments she'd once relied on. Her past haunted her. Potential suitors disappeared after a simple Google search, and her notoriety had earned her a Wikipedia page as a cautionary tale. Marcy King knocked and entered, tablet in hand. The Singapore expansion is exceeding projections, she said. Ironic, given Russell's disaster, they're exposed everything. Failure often lays the foundation for success, Alexander replied, gesturing for her to sit. Stephanie's latest project is impressive, Marcy continued, showing him a presentation. Her foundation is revolutionizing STEM education in developing countries, and the Gates partnership is just the start. Alexander nodded, thinking of how Stephanie had rebuilt her life. Her foundation and new marriage reflected resilience, a sharp contrast to Russell's downfall. The charity gala is next month, Marcy noted. Stephanie wants you there. It's at the Met again, where it all started falling apart for them. The symmetry isn't lost on me, Alexander said. An email from Jonathan arrived, confirming Russell's latest appeal had been denied. The judge's remarks were harsh. Mr. Maxwell's distress stems not from remorse, but from the consequences of his actions. Did you see his daughter's wedding announcement? Marcy asked. Alexander had. Lauren Maxwell, Russell's only child, had married recently, with the announcement mentioning only her mother and stepfather. Russell's name and presence were notably absent, rejected even in small contributions. Lauren's focused on the foundation now, Marcy said, working with her mother to salvage something positive from her father's disgrace. Alexander glanced at the city lights and smiled faintly. Choices had consequences, and while others had fallen, he had risen higher than ever. A notification lit up Alexander's phone, an alert from his building's security. Gloria had tried to enter the lobby again, claiming she had important documents for him. Like her previous attempts, each more desperate than the last, this one ended with security escorting her out. Politely, but firmly. Still trying, Marcy commented. Still failing, Alexander replied. Some lessons take longer to learn. His calendar reminder popped up, dinner with Jonathan and Kate to celebrate their second anniversary. Their relationship, formed after a betrayal, had become something real. Kate's role in exposing Gloria's infidelity had not only won Jonathan's love, but also secured her a position in Lee International's growing legal team. The book deal rejection came through, Marcy said, opening another email. Fourth publisher to turn down Gloria's memoir. Even with the NDA lifted, no one wants to touch a story that makes the author look so unsympathetic. Alexander smiled faintly. Karma writes better endings than any publisher. As dusk settled in, the city lights began to sparkle, each window in the nearby towers reminding him of how far he'd come since that rainy night when he first saw the PI's photos. His empire had expanded, built stronger by the crisis that should have torn it apart. The next morning, a news alert made Alexander pause. Russell Maxwell had attempted self-destruction in his prison cell. He survived, but the incident report painted the picture of a man finally undone by his own choices. He left a note, Jonathan told him over an emergency breakfast at the corner cafe, the same booth where they'd plotted Russell's downfall 5 years ago. Mostly rambling, Jonathan said, but he mentioned Gloria, said she was the beautiful poison that destroyed everything he built. Alexander stirred his coffee, recalling the ambitious partner who'd helped create Lee and Maxwell Enterprises. "Send flowers to Stephanie and Lauren," he said. "They may have divorced him, but they shouldn't hear about this from the media." "Already done," Jonathan replied, sliding a folder across the table. "There's more. Gloria's sister finally spoke to the press. Apparently Gloria's been spiraling since she lost her real estate license last month. Something about forging documents to inflate her sales numbers." "Old habits," Alexander said dryly. "She never understood that real success takes more than just appearances." Their waitress, Janet, still serving after all these years, brought their usual orders. "Saw your company's name in the papers again, Mr. Lee," she remarked. "Something about a new tech division." Alexander nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. Lee International's latest push into artificial intelligence had made headlines and drawn investor interest. The stock had surged 15 points overnight. "The Singapore office sends their quarterly reports today," Jonathan added after Janet left. "The project Russell nearly destroyed is now our most profitable division. Sometimes I wonder if he follows the company's success from his cell." "He does." Alexander pulled up an email on his phone. The prison psychiatrist had reached out via official channels. Apparently, Russell was obsessed with Lee International's stock ticker, checking it daily in the prison library. The morning light caught the silver in Alexander's hair. At 50, he'd become what Russell had only pretended to be, a real business titan, respected not for charm, but for substance. His phone lit up with a message from Marcy. "Look who's making headlines again." The link led to a small Connecticut newspaper. Gloria Edwards, the former Manhattan socialite, had been arrested for drunk driving after causing a scene at her ex-boyfriend's engagement party. The article naturally mentioned her past. It always did. "She tried to reach out to Russell's daughter last week," Jonathan added. "Lauren blocked her number and reported her for maltreatment. Apparently, Gloria thought she could convince Lauren to support her book project. The real story of what happened." "That's irony for you," Alexander mused. "She finally wants to tell the truth, but no one's interested." Their conversation was interrupted by another message, this time from Stephanie. The Foundation's new educational center would open next month. Would Alexander do the honors at the ribbon cutting? The press would love the symmetry. The man who'd saved the Foundation from her ex-husband's misconduct helping launch its greatest achievement. "Life has a way of sorting itself out," Alexander observed, typing his acceptance. Stephanie had built something real. Gloria and Russell had built only illusions. Later that evening, in his office high above Manhattan, Alexander reviewed a personal document he rarely opened, his original plan, drafted the night he'd first seen the PI's photos of Gloria and Russell. Every step had been laid out. The careful gathering of evidence, the strategic positioning of allies, the precise timing of each revelation. But the document's final page held something he'd never shared with anyone, a list of possible outcomes for all involved. He'd predicted Russell's financial collapse, Gloria's social fall, and even the likelihood of attempted comebacks and reconciliations. What he hadn't predicted was how complete their destruction would be, how thoroughly their own choices would compound the consequences he had set in motion. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Lee, Mrs. Cornell is here. Stephanie says it's urgent." Stephanie entered his office, looking every bit the sophisticated philanthropist she'd become. Marriage to Judge Cornell had erased the last traces of the uncertain woman she'd been as Russell's wife. "I thought you should hear this from me first," she began, taking a seat. "Russell's being transferred to the prison psychiatric unit. The self-destruction attempt. It's worse than they first reported." The doctors say he's had a complete breakdown. He keeps talking about Wednesday nights and hotel rooms, about how he should have seen the signs. Alexander absorbed this silently, recalling another conversation in this office years ago when he'd promised Stephanie that her foundation would survive Russell's downfall. "Lauren asked me to tell you something else," Stephanie continued. "She's legally changing her name. She wants no connection to Russell Maxwell anymore. The foundation will be her legacy now, not his." Alexander's gaze drifted to the city lights flickering to life outside his window as day turned to night. Somewhere in Connecticut, Gloria was probably facing the consequences of her latest public meltdown. In a prison psychiatric ward, Russell Maxwell was finally confronting the true cost of his choices. And here, in the heart of the empire they tried to destroy, Alexander Lee sat with the woman who'd risen from the same ashes that had consumed them. "We all make choices," he said finally. "Some of us choose to build, others to betray. The difference is in living with the consequences." Stephanie smiled, understanding in her eyes. "You never just wanted revenge, did you? You wanted justice." "I wanted them to understand exactly what they'd thrown away," Alexander corrected. "The rest they did to themselves." As night fell over Manhattan, Alexander Lee stood at his window, master of an empire built from the ruins of betrayal. Below, the city pulsed with life, each light a reminder that endings were just beginnings in disguise. He'd lost a wife and a business partner, but gained something far more valuable. Proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't just about destroying the old, but building something stronger in its place. His phone buzzed one last time, Jonathan confirming tomorrow's board meeting. Another quarter, another success, another step forward. While others remained trapped by the consequences of their past, Alexander reflected. True power wasn't in the ability to take revenge, but in the strength to transform it into triumph. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one a testament to the empire he'd built from betrayal's ashes, while somewhere in the darkness, two people who once thought themselves clever enough to deceive him faced the long, cold reality of their choices.